1 minute ago, something shifted behind closed doors in Washington in a way that even seasoned diplomats are now struggling to fully explain. Before we roll the footage, just one thing. If you enjoy our work, drop a like and hit subscribe. Over 98% of you are watching without subscribing. Let's change that right now. It's free for you, but it fuels everything we do. Subscribed, perfect. Now enjoy the video, because what took place in the early hours of that morning was not just another off-the-record discussion or a routine exercise in strategic coordination, but a carefully timed, tightly controlled encounter that appears to have set off a chain reaction stretching from the corridors of the White House to the core institutions of Europe, and at the centre of it all stood, and operating with a level of precision and timing that suggests this moment had been anticipated, rehearsed, and ultimately executed with a clarity of purpose that left very little room for improvisation or retreat. The meeting itself was never meant to be visible, at least not in the way major diplomatic engagements typically are, because there were no official announcements, no pre-briefed journalists waiting outside, and no coordinated press releases prepared to frame the narrative in advance, which immediately created an information vacuum that would later be filled not by formal statements, but by fragments of testimony, selective leaks, and carefully worded denials that only deepened the sense that something unusually consequential had taken place. And especially when it became clear that one of the individuals present in that room was a senior envoy connected directly to Ray, carrying with them documents that had reportedly been finalised in Brussels just hours before departure, under the assumption that they would form the basis of a structured negotiation rather than serve as a reference point in what would quickly feel more like a controlled disclosure of predetermined outcomes. What makes this moment particularly difficult to analyse is not simply the secrecy that surrounded it, but the consistency of the accounts that began emerging within hours. Because despite coming from different sources with varying levels of proximity to the event, they all describe the same sequence unfolding with an almost scripted rhythm, beginning with an opening that defied diplomatic convention and immediately altered the psychological balance of the room, as Trump reportedly bypassed all formalities and moved directly into a statement that reframed the entire interaction, not as a dialogue between partners, but as a declaration of intent, effectively collapsing the space in which negotiation usually takes place and replacing it with a dynamic in which the response itself would become the trigger for what followed. According to individuals who later spoke to outlets including Andes, the materials presented during that meeting were not exploratory in nature, but operational, meaning they outlined actions that were already aligned with internal timelines rather than proposals awaiting approval. And this distinction is critical because it suggests that the purpose of the meeting was not to shape the strategy, but to signal its activation, which in turn explains why the European side, despite arriving with prepared counterpoints and contingency positions, found themselves reacting to a framework that had effectively removed the traditional levers of negotiation. As the details continued to surface, a clearer picture began to form of what was actually placed on the table that night, and it revolved around a structured set of scenarios that each pointed toward a different configuration of transatlantic relations, ranging from a managed realignment of trade and defence priorities to a far more disruptive sequence of actions that would introduce friction across multiple sectors simultaneously, including energy distribution, financial flows and supply chain dependencies that had long been treated as stable under existing agreements. And it is precisely this multi-layered approach that has led analysts from institutions such as to describe the strategy as systemic rather than situational, meaning it was designed to operate across interconnected domains in a way that amplifies pressure over time rather than relying on a single point of leverage. The turning point, however, appears to have come not from the content of those documents alone, but from the response they elicited. Because when the European envoy signalled that the terms as presented were not acceptable within the current political and economic framework of the Union, that moment effectively confirmed the scenario that had been anticipated by the American side. Thereby triggering the transition from presentation to execution. A shift that was subtle in tone but significant in consequence, as it marked the point at which the strategy moved from conditional pathways into active progression, something that would only become fully visible in the hours and days that followed. By the time markets opened later that morning, the first indicators of change were already appearing. Not in dramatic collapses or headline-grabbing disruptions, but in smaller, more technical adjustments that signalled a recalibration taking place beneath the surface, including fluctuations in currency valuations, shifts in commodity pricing linked to anticipated supply changes, and revised forecasts issued by financial institutions that had begun incorporating new variables into their models based on information that had not yet been publicly confirmed but was clearly influencing decision-making at a high level. Inside Europe, the response unfolded in stages, beginning with internal consultations that quickly escalated into emergency sessions as the scope of the situation became clearer, particularly when it became evident that the actions outlined in Washington were not isolated measures, but part of a broader sequence that would require coordinated responses across multiple member states, each with its own economic priorities and political constraints, thereby introducing an additional layer of complexity that made rapid consensus both necessary and difficult at the same time, publicly. Officials attempted to maintain a tone of stability, emphasising ongoing dialogue and the importance of preserving long-standing partnerships, but privately the language was shifting toward contingency planning and risk mitigation, reflecting a growing recognition that the assumptions underpinning those partnerships were being tested in ways that had not been fully anticipated, especially given the speed at which developments were unfolding and the limited window available to formulate an effective response. What further intensified the situation was the reaction from outside the transatlantic sphere, as other global actors began adjusting their positions in response to the emerging uncertainty, with some viewing the moment as an opportunity to renegotiate terms or expand influence in areas where alignment had previously been dominated by US-EU cooperation, while others adopted a more cautious approach, monitoring the situation closely and preparing for potential ripple effects that could impact everything from trade routes to investment flows. At the same time, the private sector moved with a decisiveness that often outpaced official responses, as corporations and financial institutions recalibrated their strategies based on forward-looking assessments rather than confirmed outcomes, redirecting investments, reassessing exposure, and in some cases pausing major projects until greater clarity emerged. And all of which contributed to a feedback loop in which economic signals began reinforcing the perception of a shifting landscape even before formal policy changes were fully implemented. What makes this moment particularly significant is not just the immediate impact of the actions taken, but the precedent they establish, because by compressing the timeline between decision and execution, and by limiting the space for negotiation through controlled disclosure, the approach effectively redefines how strategic moves of this scale can be conducted, raising questions about whether this represents a temporary tactic or a more permanent evolution in how power is exercised within the international system. And this is where the narrative becomes even more complex, because while much of the focus has been on the transatlantic relationship itself, there is a growing body of analysis suggesting that the implications extend far beyond that mihwa, touching on the broader architecture of global governance and the assumptions that have guided it for decades, particularly the idea that certain alliances are resilient enough to absorb pressure without fundamentally changing their structure. If that assumption is now being challenged, then the consequences are not confined to a single region or set of policies, but extend into the underlying logic that shapes how countries interact, cooperate, and compete, which in turn raises the stakes of every decision being made in response to this situation, as each choice carries not only immediate effects but also long-term implications for how similar scenarios may be handled in the future. As of now, there is still no definitive resolution in sight, and that uncertainty is itself a defining feature of the current moment, because it creates a space in which multiple outcomes remain possible, each with its own trajectory and set of consequences, making it difficult to predict not only what will happen next, but how quickly it will unfold once the next phase begins. So the questions that remain are not just about the specifics of that 2 a.m. meeting, but about what it represents in a broader sense and whether we are witnessing an isolated episode of strategic assertiveness or the early stages of a more profound shift in the balance of global power. One that will continue to reveal itself not through a single dramatic event, but through a series of interconnected developments that gradually reshape the landscape in ways that only become fully visible in hindsight. And because if the accounts are accurate, and if the patterns we are now seeing are indeed part of a coordinated sequence, then what happened in that room was not the culmination of a process, but the beginning of one. And the real story is not what has already occurred, but what is about to follow. As decisions made in silence begin to surface in actions that can no longer be contained, forcing governments, markets, and institutions to respond in real time to a situation that is evolving faster than traditional frameworks were designed to handle. Which leads to the final and most unsettling set of questions, the ones that are now being asked behind closed doors in capitals across the world. If this was only the opening move, how far does the strategy extend? How many steps have already been planned? And when the next moment like this arrives, will anyone see it coming before it is already in motion? If you want to stay ahead of that answer, not after it is explained, but while it is still unfolding, then this is the moment to pay attention. Because what comes next will not wait for confirmation. It will arrive in fragments, in signals, in shifts that seem small until they connect. And by the time the full picture is visible, the outcome may already be locked in. So subscribe now and stay with this story as it develops, because the next update could change everything again.